Happy weekend, everybody out there in Calibration land. This is Kevin, and you're listening to the 9th installment of the PT Guru Podcast Weekend Edition. Today, we're going to talk about what it takes to be an ASQ CCT.
It's been a long time coming. 6 days a week and 10 hours a shift. What about the OT? Well, it ain't worth this. This ain't no 9 to 5 out here on these production lines. So I told them where to shove it, then they could read between the lines.
All right, so for the second weekend in a row, we're podcasting to you live on YouTube. Well, as live as I do it, it'll be on recording on YouTube. But trying to do this thing, get it kicking. Got some people liking what I'm doing with the videos sort of interface version of the podcast, so figure we'll do a little bit more of that. And turn me up just a hair here. And so, first things first, what did we talk about this week? So if you're just watching on the video, you can go back and say, hey, I should check some of these things out. They sound interesting to me. So this week, we talked a bit about instrument tolerances. Where do they come from? Why they exist, and more importantly, how do we calculate them? Sometimes you'll see some weird numbers with these things, and it gets into a whole algebraic formula. And so we talk a lot about how we actually arrive at the tolerance based on the instrument and its specifications and how misleading those specs can be at times. Tuesday, we talked about how you should be using your uncertainty. As an end user of a calibration product, you should be getting uncertainty if you're sending it to an accredited lab, which you know you should be. You get an uncertainty number there. How can you use that as an end user? It's kind of a useful tool for a lot of things, and we talk about some of those things. Talked about IR thermometers on Wednesday, kind of our equipment day. Not just IR thermometers, but how to use an IR thermometer. Some things you might not be thinking about when you use an IR thermometer. Most people think you just point and shoot. It's not that simple to get an accurate measurement. Then on Thursday, did a quality tool, 5-Wise. Love that. One of my favorite quality tools. Use it all the time. Use it in my personal life, just because it's such a powerful and useful and easy tool to use. And then on Friday, we talked about ILAC, the International Laboratory Accreditation Cooperation, and what they do to help all these ABs worldwide all be on the same page at the same time. So let's get to our weekend content. Kind of a high-level thing, as I've talked about before, but this is a really good one to be aware of. And that is what is going to go into becoming a certified calibration technician. So I'm one. So I got a little room to talk about this one. ASQ is the only the only organization I know that is really recognized for accrediting calibration technicians. We'll get into that in just a moment. But, in the calibration industry, there's a lot of technicians, a lot of folks doing this kind of work. And, technicians really run the gamut of being somebody who maybe does that 10% of their job. A lot of times an in-house person that has another job to do will be handling some of the calibration work. In that case, he may only dedicate a few hours a week to calibration, all the way up to full-time calibration folks that really just spend their whole careers doing nothing but calibration. So we've talked about the best way to ensure quality calibration results from a calibration laboratory is to choose some folks that are ISO 17025 accredited by one of those ABs that's been accredited by ILAC. So if you really want to make sure everything's perfect, you should be looking also for a company that has certified calibration technicians to perform your measurements for you. So, in a similar vein, how do we know our technicians are the highest quality? We get them certified. That's what we do. So, we got ISO 17025. We got certified calibration technicians. We can be really confident that we're getting good results. So, I said ASQ, Certified Calibration Technician. ASQ is the American Society for Quality. And it's the only organization that I'm really aware of that produces a well-recognized certification program for calibration technicians. Now, I know quite a bit about this program because I'm a CCT, have been so for about 8 or 9 years now. CCT is kind of the acronym for Certified Calibration Technician. I also teach a course for ASQ based on the curriculum that they've developed. I also participated in the revision of the certification exam, which just kind of went through in the past 6 months or so. So if you go to take the test, there's a good chance you're going to be seeing some questions I wrote for the test on the test, because I submitted about 30 or 40 questions to the exam. The body of knowledge changed a little bit over the course of the past 6 months to a year, and so we had to change the test a little bit to match up with the body of knowledge better. Some things came off, some new things came in. They really try to keep current with what practices are today versus, old knowledge is just not used as much anymore because we've come up with some different ways to do things, better ways, and you see less and less of certain other types of measurements than you used to. So if you're interested in becoming a certified calibration technician or CCT, or you want to know what's required to become a CCT, you've come to the right place, because that's what we're going to talk about today. And there's a lot to it, so buckle up. There's a lot that's going on. You'd really be impressed with how much a person that's going to get this certification really has to know to be able to do this test. And, if you're a consumer of measurement products, this is going to kind of tell you what all goes into really becoming this certified calibration technician. And you'll realize how important that really is from a perspective of knowledge levels that are required. So diving right in, let's talk about how you go about the process to begin with. So to become a CCT, you need to pass an exam. Easy enough. Study, pass the exam. However, ASQ requires that you have 5 years experience before you can sit for the exam. This does not mean you have to have 5 years of experience as a calibration technician. It just means you need to be in some kind of related field. So any of the things that we discuss in this body of knowledge that we're going to talk about here in a moment count towards that experience. Also, if you have a secondary degree, college, whatever along those lines, you can get up to a couple of years waived off that experience requirement, saying that, okay, you've got this higher knowledge, you've studied things, it's getting you closer to where you need to be. So for the most part, the test is offered online pretty much only. You go to a testing center and you go and take it. They have listed on the body of knowledge that it's still available in written form, but I think they're really heavily trying to phase that out. So we'll talk about the computer form, the online form. You go to a testing center, they'll give you some info and tell you what all you got to do. You have 4.5 hours to complete the test. That's how in-depth this thing is. You got 4 hours to do it. And it's going to consist of 135 questions drawn from several fields in the body of knowledge, or BOK. The exam is open book. Helpful there. You can also bring a calculator. All the same kind of academic rules, though, apply where calculators can't have certain types of memory. They can't do certain things. They have some restrictions as to what you can and can't bring. So follow those things before you go. There's a lot. They spell out the rules pretty clearly on the website. So go through those before you show up to take the test. Remember that you're going to have to register ahead of time. I think it's about a month ahead before to take a particular test, but that's just all part of the process. This is not an overnight thing. Don't expect it to be. So let's dive right into the body of knowledge and show you how much stuff you need to know, or how much stuff, if you're a customer looking to hire somebody, how much stuff I need to know to get this certification. So body of knowledge is basically broken up into 5 sections, and we'll go through those. General metrology is going to make up 30 questions of the test. Measurement systems, another 26 questions of the test. Calibration systems is 30 questions of the test. So these systems and metrology concepts make up the majority of the test. Then we have my personal favorite, uncertainty and applied mathematics. That's just me. Everybody else probably is their most hated part. And then quality systems and standards make up 15 questions, really rudimentary knowledge there. But we'll dive into what goes into each one of these sections. So we've got general metrology. What are we talking about with general metrology? We need to understand base and derived SI units. You need to know the big 7, and then further develop all the other units that grow out of the big 7. A lot of this stuff is in the actual documentation that you can get for this. So nothing to stress out over. Just know how to find this info. Know that there are 7 primary units or 7 primary measurements that we do that everything else is derived from. Then we need to know SI multipliers and conversions. This is those sort of decade things like the milli and kilo and micro, how to convert between these things, how to recognize and understand them. Then we're going to have fundamental constants. Again, you can just look them up. They're in the materials that you're likely going to have. And these are things like knowing the value of G or the speed of light in a vacuum, things that go into measurements, but we need to just be aware of them, need to know how to get them. Don't try to memorize the speed of light in a vacuum. You don't need to know it at that level. It's nice too, but it's better just to know where you can look it up. So then we're going to look at common measurements and common measurements techniques. Things like temperature, pressure, humidity, force, torque, mass, various electrical properties, time and frequency, and then dimensional measurements. That's kind of the big things all put in there. Then you need to know about traceability. And from this aspect of traceability, they're mainly talking about the traceability standards hierarchy. So how things flow from the BIPM out to NIST, out to your primary labs, and on down the chain. You need to be aware of that traceability pyramid that we're talking about here. And then we're going to look at measurement standards. You just kind of need some definitions on these. Primary, working, consensus, what these things are, how they're different, how they're the same. And then one of the big ones in this chapter here is also substitution of standards and determining whether it's okay to make a substitution. How to determine whether that's okay or not. And just looking at the actual tolerances and those kind of things and making a decision to say, yes, this is okay, or no, this is not okay. So that's kind of our general metrology section. A lot going on in there. That's a big chunk of the test is based on that. Then we move to measurement systems. So what do we differ here between metrology and measurement? The metrology part is really about the idea of the different sorts of units and different testing and different types of ideas with these things. With measurement systems, now we talk about how we actually do calibration, how we actually do measurement systems. Measurement methods is going to be the first kind of category here. That's where we're going to talk about direct measurements versus indirect measurements, maybe using a transfer standard, those kind of things. You need to be able to identify what these different methods are. Then we're going to look at measurement characteristics, things like bias, linearity, sensitivity. Data considerations, how data is being tracked, how it's being recorded, making sure you maintain data integrity. Then IM and TE specifications. IM and TE means inspecting, measurement, and test equipment. Get used to that acronym. They use it a lot in the questions and such. Basically, they're talking about, okay, it's the stuff we're testing. That's really what they're looking at with that sort of acronym. So the stuff we're testing or our calibration standards are also IM and TE. But you're going to see that a lot throughout, so just get used to that particular little acronym. It's just kind of what they've settled on that everybody's going to understand and know how to use. From there, we look at error sources, common error sources from things like drift, bias, operator error, other problems. You need to be able to identify that, okay, here's a set of data, and this is what the error that I'm looking at is. Oh, the 0 is off all the way through the scale. That's an issue with bias. Easy enough. And then also we're going to look at MAPs or measurement assurance programs. And this is stuff like proficiency testing and interlaboratory comparisons that we use to validate the measurements that we actually perform. So notice all these things about measurements, kind of a big part of calibration. So from there, next big heavy hitter, our third topic, is going to be calibration systems. Under calibration systems, we're going to look at calibration procedures. What goes into a procedure? What things belong in there to make sure a procedure is sufficient to be used to perform a calibration. Then we'll look at adjustment and standardization methods. So how do we go about maybe adjusting things that do not meet tolerances, that's where we're going to look at this. So we look at things like spanning, nulling, linearization, all these different sort of methods that we go about to adjust a calibrated item. From there, we'll look at industry practices and regulations. This has a lot to do with understanding where the various guidelines used in calibration come from. Are we looking at industry things? Are we looking at international standards? Where are these things coming from? And how do we know how to choose which ones we need for a given calibration? From there, environmental controls. Very important, especially if you're in the world of dimensional measurement, can be very important in other things too. We look at contamination causing issues, humidity, all kinds of things like that. So environmental controls, where they're important, what they mean, how they affect other things. Calibration processes for IM and TE. There we're going to look at things like how a process flows through a lab, the logistics, how we move things around, scheduling, responsibilities, who does what in the calibration lab and the calibration process. All these things kind of factor into the idea of this overall calibration process and maintaining data integrity throughout the entire system, the entire process that we're dealing with. From there, we'll look at validation process. How do we do validation? What needs validation? That's a big heavy hitter right there. What actually needs to be validated? You need to know how to answer that question because they're going to ask. I know they're going to ask because I wrote some of those questions. Records management. How are we keeping things? How are we looking at things? How are we maintaining our data? How are we maintaining our records? And then official reports. And the idea here is to identify the difference between an official report and something that's maybe preliminary data that needs to be saved anyway, because if it's your initial recording of data, you need to be maintaining it, but how to recognize the difference, though, between an official report, a calibration certificate, calibration report, whatever you want to call it, versus just data. So that's our third section. Moving into my fourth and favorite section is measurement uncertainty and applied mathematics. My favorite, everybody else's nemesis. It's not, doesn't make up a huge portion of the questions, but it's still really important that we know these things. In all honesty, the questions in this section are not that hard if you're well aware of the concepts that we're dealing with. So we look at uncertainty terminology, repeatability, divisors, test uncertainty ratio, error. We kind of got rid of all the stuff with test accuracy ratio, thankfully, because that was just a mess. I contributed heavily in this particular section of the current version of the exam, so I kind of know a little bit about what's going on in there. Uncertainty budget components. This is where we look at things like type A and type B, what falls into those categories, then also the things that need to be in there. If you're doing a dimensional measurement, you've got to consider temperature somehow in your uncertainty. So things like that what needs to be in a particular uncertainty, and you need to be aware of those things. You need to know. Uncertainty determination and reporting. This is more the math part of uncertainty. What divisors are you going to use? How are you going to put these together? Do you have a standard uncertainty or an expanded uncertainty? That's all in this sort of section of determination and reporting. So from there, we move to the technical and applied mathematics. This is stuff you need to know and you should be aware of, especially if you're in this sort of world of calibration. We're going to look at their things like scientific versus engineering notation, how to convert between just regular notation that you're used to, then the scientific notation and the engineering notation for numbers. English to metric conversions, being that ASQ is most heavily represented in the United States, is still kind of a big deal. And we need to be aware of it, know how to do it. You need to know how to do things like ratios. You need to interpret tables and graphs. They might show you a graph of something and say, how to correlate an X and a Y point to get a good estimate for a particular situation. From there, we'll look at rounding versus truncation and significant digits. Really important stuff there for calibration folks, no question about it. Then order of operations. This is something you learn in middle school, high school, and it kind of sticks with you. And if you don't know it, it's really important, because what they'll do is they'll give you questions where you need to apply the actual order of operations to properly solve an equation. So I will always remember the "Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally" as the acronym to get through the different types of operations and what order they go into. Algebra. You need to know some algebra. It's fairly simple algebra. It's solving for variables, moving things around. That's nothing too crazy. Angular conversions are in there as well. And when we're talking about angular conversions, we're talking about converting mainly from like degrees, minutes, seconds to radians. Pretty easy to do. And in all honesty, your scientific calculator that you're probably going to bring into the exam, if you learn how to use all the little functions on it, it'll do it for you. So keep that in mind. So that wraps up the mathematics and uncertainty and applied mathematics section. Then that moves us to our final section, which is quality systems and standards. For the most part, these are really high-level concepts. They're things that you need to be aware of for the most part. So we'll start out by looking at quality management systems. Identify different components and also tactical reasons for having a robust quality system. How can this potentially help me in my business if I've got a robust quality system? There's a myriad ways, so really be aware of that. Then we'll look at quality control tools, how to use some of the different quality control tools that are available. Like I talked about a 5Y the other day, that's one of them. Other things to interpret data like process maps and control charts and other diagrams can be commonly used. There's several of them when you get the study materials for this that they go through in there and just kind of give you some ideas of different ways to look at them and what would work best in certain situations. That's kind of what they're going to ask you questions on here. Is say, hey, we've got this set of data things that we're dealing with, and we were thinking about doing things a different way. Which quality tool would be the best one to use to do this particular sort of analysis? From there, we look at quality audits. Mainly, we're looking at types of audits versus assessments, the different roles that people play in these different conformity situations, and then also what goes into it. What are the components of an actual audit or assessment? Any of those things. Then from there, corrective action, which typically follows an audit or an assessment, idea of nonconformance identification, and then the ability to do an impact assessment. That's your real big stuff with corrective action. Then briefly, professional conduct and ethics. I mean, that kind of goes without saying. Hopefully you can answer those without having to crack a book. I really hope anyway. Occupational safety requirements, being safe in the work we're performing. As calibration technicians, we regularly deal with some things that can be a little bit dangerous. We work in electrical panels that are turned on when we're working in them. We need them to be turned on because we need things to be working when we're working on them. So just those safety requirements need to be aware of, need to know what's going on. Basic housekeeping, which is just good practice, especially in calibration world. Friend of mine said that a coworker says, dirt measures. Yeah, and he's right. Especially like dimensional measurement. If something's dirty, it's going to have a different measurement than if it's nice and clean. Pretty self-explanatory there. So good housekeeping is just good stuff when it comes to your quality system. And then you need to be aware of basic various quality standards and guidelines. Here we're talking about things like 9001, 17025, 17043 if you're dealing with proficiency testing, ANSI Z540 and its various versions, the GUM, Guide to Uncertainty in Measurement, the VIM, the Vocabulary in Measurement, and then things like accreditation bodies. Those are all really important things. So you can be confident that a technician is qualified after hearing that list of subjects that need to be known in order to get that certified calibration technician moniker added to the end of your name. Having certified calibration technicians performing your calibrations are really going to take things to a whole new level of scrutiny and ensure that you're receiving the best possible quality for your measurements. So if you're interested in becoming an ASQ certified calibration technician, visit the ASQ website or drop me a line on my website, www.ptguruconsulting.com, and I will be happy to point you in the right direction. While you're there, say hi, leave a note, ask a question. Let me know how you're doing. Hey, if you can do me a real huge favor and you have been listening to the podcast, swing over to the iTunes store and leave me a rating. Let me know how I'm doing. It does great for me. It also helps to make the machine recognize that, hey, people are listening to this thing and they're digging it, or they're not digging it. That's cool too. But drop by there, leave me a rating. I very much appreciate it. So I hope you have a really, really great weekend. Enjoy yourself, and I'm going to be back to talking at you on Monday. So peace out.